Yeah, so I made you a monologue. All right, you savvy scholars of the written word. You've conquered 60 lessons, dodged grammatical grenades, and outsmarted tricky texts. Now, as we delve into the 61st realm of wisdom, imagine this. The fearless English apprentice, armed with a strategy sharper than a wordplay ninja's wit. It's your final push, your literary shutdown, your chance to dance with the examiner's expectations. So, buckle up, because in this grand finale module, you and me, we're unlocking the secret vault of Eames' wisdom. Prepare to wield your ink-stained sword of knowledge, for you're about to pen the saga of your English ATAR triumph. The work you've sown, it's time to reap. The sweat you've shed, it's time to make it glisten on paper. Let's turn those hours of toil into an artful symphony of success. Get ready, because in this lesson, my dear Eames aficionado, you'll learn not just to swim, but to surf the waves of English ATAR excellence. Basically, now you get to really benefit from all the hard work you've done.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the last module of English ATAR Made Simple. You should be extremely proud of yourself for making it to this point of the course. Also, don't mind me old phone in the background. I am just filming a time-lapse. I am a sucker for a time-lapse. Double also, yes, I am going for a Barbie color scheme in this module. I hope you like it as much as I do. Triple also, I know you'll be tempted to watch this lesson before completing the prior lessons in the prior modules. That is your prerogative. But you should know that about 50% of the content we're discussing in this lesson refers to specific content that has already been discussed in lessons prior to this one. So if you have completed all the lessons prior to this one, you are in the best position possible to truly benefit from the English ATAR Made Simple exam strategy. If you haven't watched all the previous lessons, don't say I didn't warn you. That being said, if you've gained access to this course right before an English ATAR exam and just literally haven't had time to complete everything up to this point, you'll still be able to take away some very useful information. Now that's out of the way, let's see what is in store for this lesson. Even though this is not titled Intro to Module 6, we still have to do a little check-in with the pair. You know how this goes. We'll revise the modules in Eames. Don't forget where you came from. Then we shall revise the objectives of Stone 3. Specifically, we will revise the objective of Module 6. Then we'll get to the main reason why we're here. We'll discuss this strategy. That will involve firstly explaining Phase 1, reading, then Phase 2, comprehending, Phase 3, responding, Phase 4, composing, Phase 5, reviewing with an asterisk, and then one unadulterated simple summary. Let's rewind and check in with our favorite fruit. Now, this was where you were before starting Eames. The moment you started that first lesson in Module 1 was the moment you left Struggle City and hopped onto Stone 1, understand the concepts. You knew with all of your heart that you were never going back to Struggle City, so you just lit it up and said see ya. When you started the first lesson in Module 2, you wriggled a little bit closer to Stone 2, but didn't make the leap just yet. However, shortly thereafter, the moment you started the first lesson in Module 3, you leapt from Stone 1 to Stone 2. That meant you got one step closer to pass English ATAR Island. Then, when you started Module 4, you moved another little bit closer to pass English ATAR Island. The same goes for when you started Module 5, which was large, I know, but hey, it's done and dusted now. And that also means we can say goodbye to Stone 2. Stone 2 was the most demanding stone of the entire course. Huge congrats for finishing it. That's our overview of the pair. Let's check in with the modules in Eames again. Stone 1, understand the concepts. Module 1, change your mind. Finished that ages ago. Module 2, still on Stone 1, master the Bibles. Thank God that's done. Overarching objective of Stone 1, understand the mental skills and the key concepts necessary to pass English ATAR. As you know, that was no small feat, so congratulations. Our focus then shifted to Stone 2, develop the exam strategy, which consisted of Module 3, command comprehending, finito. Then we turned to Module 4, rule responding, Dunsky. Then we said hello to our not too distant friend, Module 5, where we conquered the composing section. Once we finished Module 5, we completed Stone 2. So let's just give that a big fat tick as well. That means there is only one stone and one module left to go. That stone is practice the skills, and practicing those skills will then enable you to just ace the WACE. This module brings together everything we have learned in the entire course, and it really puts that knowledge to the test. So with that being said, this is the objective of Stone 3. We will practice the learned skills by completing a practice exam. Bom, bom, bom. That's the objective of Stone 3. Here is the objective of the module we've just started. Understand how to complete an English ATAR exam and apply that understanding by completing a practice exam. The objective of Stone 3 and the objective of Module 6, basically the same. But you get the idea. Now let's just get stuck into the juicy stuff. What is the English ATAR Made Simple exam strategy? We've got some phases. Who doesn't love a phase? Reading may be the phase 1 of the EAMS exam strategy, but it certainly wasn't my first phase. To make this perfectly clear, phase 1, reading, applies to your reading time in the actual exam, for which you have 10 minutes. By the way, each phase has a hierarchy. We've got the phase and then a stage. Stage 1 is the first thing you'll be doing in phase 1 reading. At stage 1, we are choosing your responding section question and composing section question. The specific time allocation you have for this stage is between 2 to 3 minutes. Stage 2 of phase 1 is read the comprehending section texts. For this specific stage, you have between 7 to 8 minutes. Third stage of phase 1, mark your responding section question and composing section question, approximately 10 seconds. Our fourth and final stage of phase 1, take 2 deep breaths. Fucking joke. No, I am not. Approximately 30 seconds. That's phase 1. These are the first 4 things you'll be doing in the entire exam. Then we go to phase 2, which is comprehending. The comprehending section of your exam is worth 30%. Total time allocation for this is 55 minutes. I'll be explaining why 55 and not 60 later on in the lesson. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to question 1. Specific time allocation between 10 to 12 minutes. Stage 2, write your response to question 1. Time allocation 15 to 17 minutes. Stage 3, use the planning steps to plan your response to question 2. Phase 4, write your response to question 2. I'm disappointed in myself. That's phase 2. Then we turn to the juiciest part of the entire exam. It's phase 3. It's the responding section. It's worth 40%. And for that reason, our total time allocation is 70 minutes. Yes, that's right. I said 70. Stage 1. Use the planning steps to plan your response to the question you marked in phase 1, stage 3. For this stage, you have 10 to 15 minutes. Stage 2, write your response to the question. For this, you've got between 55 and 60 minutes. Nice and easy. Phase 3, done. Phase 4, composing, it's worth 30%, same as comprehending. And that should give you a hint as to the total time allocation for this section, 55 minutes. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to the question you marked in phase 1, stage 3. For this stage, you've got between 10 to 15 minutes. Stage 2, write your response to the question. For this, you've got between 40 and 45 minutes. Our fifth and final phase, it's the reviewing. Importantly, the total time allocation for this phase is any remaining spare time if you finish early. Emphasis on if. Stage 1 of this phase, if you have time for it, complete any unfinished responses. Stage 2, select a response to review. Stage 3, review the response by applying the appropriate review principle or principles. Stage 4, last one, repeat stage 2 and stage 3 until the exam's finished. There you have it, our 5 phases of the EAMS exam strategy. That's the overview of the thing. Let's go into more detail, starting with an in-depth discussion about phase 1, reading. I reckon this is the most important phase of the entire exam strategy. Your ability to take on board what I'm about to say will dictate how well you perform in the exam. Big call, I know, but I am a firm believer in this. This is an overview of phase 1. Stage 1 of phase 1, choose your responding section question and composing section question. Do that in approximately 2 to 3 minutes. Here's an explanation as to why I recommend doing this as the very first thing in the exam. Once the invigilator has announced the reading time has commenced, turn to the page of the exam booklet with the responding section questions. Read each question, select the one you want to answer, take a mental note of the question number. Then repeat those steps in relation to the composing section questions. Okay, that's what we're doing, but why? Firstly, you're eliminating the possibility of wasting time deliberating over which question to choose later on in the exam. Secondly, this lets you focus on reading the comprehending section text in the remaining reading time. A tip in relation to this stage: don't overthink which questions to select. Your gut knows. Stage 2, read the comprehending section text in 7 to 8 minutes. What does this involve doing? Once you've selected your responding section question and composing section question, spend the remaining reading time, ideally between 7 to 8 minutes, reading and comprehending each text. Why do we do that? You will have to read and comprehend the text in section 1 of the exam at some point. You may as well do this during the reading time. That is why it exists. A tip in relation to this stage: read and comprehend each text by identifying relevant language features and pondering how they communicate meaning. I've got a couple of cautionary tales to tell you regarding phase 1. The first cautionary tale relates to Sarah. Sarah is sitting her English ATAR WACE exam. The reading time has just started. They read the text in the comprehending section but struggle to focus on them because they're too worried about writing all the quotes they crammed into their brain for the responding section 30 minutes ago. The invigilator says, "You may start writing." And Sarah heads straight to the responding section where they can brain dump the quotes. About an hour later, Sarah finishes the responding section and returns to the comprehending section. Because they were too distracted by memorizing their quotes during the reading time, and because it's been an hour since they initially skimmed over the text in the comprehending section, they have to read them all over again. This takes Sarah about 10 minutes. The point of the story is this: use most of your reading time to read the text in section 1. That way you can start answering the questions in section 1 straight away once the reading time finishes. You're doing this because those texts are still fresh in your mind. You might be wondering, but what about the quotes? Look, to be blunt, markers care so much more about the analysis of those quotes rather than their accuracy. Your analysis is where you get all the marks. Stage 3, mark your responding section question and composing section question with asterisks. This should take approximately 10 seconds. Explanation: once the invigilator announces, "You may start writing," immediately turn the page to the responding section questions and mark the question you selected in stage 1 with an asterisk. Repeat the above in relation to the composing section. That's what we're doing. Why are we doing it? We're marking each question with an asterisk because it means you won't forget which question you selected once you start the section it belongs to. More importantly, marking each question with an asterisk is a visual reminder you've already invested time determining which questions are the best to answer and that you should not waste time second guessing that decision. Here's a tip in relation to this stage: don't underestimate the power of this visual reminder. This step means your present self is entering into a contract with your future self. In other words, trust the asterisks. That leads me into cautionary tale number 2. It's about Gus. Gus is sitting his English ATAR WACE exam. The reading time has just started. He reads the text in the comprehending section and then the questions in the responding section. He likes the sound of question 5 and says to himself, "I'm going to answer that one." He then proceeds to the composing section, likes the sound of question 11 and says to himself, "I'm going to answer that one." Then the invigilator says, "You may start writing," and Gus starts the comprehending section. About an hour later, once the comprehending section is completed, Gus moves on to the responding section and looks at the questions for a second time. He sees question 5, but is unsure if that's the question he wants to answer. He has a read of the other questions, wonders whether any of them are better than question 5, ultimately decides that question 5 is still the best, and proceeds to answer that question. About 70 minutes later, Gus moves on to the composing section. Once again, he reads through the question to see whether any are better than the original one he chose, question 11. After a minute or so, he eventually decides that question 11 is still the best question and answers that one. Almost an hour later, Gus is still writing the conclusion of his persuasive speech and has about 3 sentences left. Suddenly, the invigilator says, "Pens down," and Gus doesn't get a chance to finish his conclusion. The point of this story is simple: trust the asterisks. Had Gus done that, he wouldn't have wasted those 2 to 3 minutes questioning the decision he made in the reading time. If he hadn't doubted himself, he would have been able to finish his conclusion. Please trust me on this. Trust the asterisks. Finally, we move on to stage 4. Take 2 breaths, approximately 30 seconds. What the F word, terrible mouth on me, is this all about? Allow me to explain to you. Actually, that's really all there is to it, kind of. Once you've marked your responding section question and composing section question with asterisks, take 2 deep breaths using the box breathing technique. Now, originally I intended to explain this to you myself. Even though I am a big fan of breathwork, I am no expert, but I happen to know someone who is much more informed than I am. She is very dear to me. Here is Inner Glow Guide to explain to you how to do box breathing.
My name's Hannah from Inner Glow Guide, and today I'm going to show you how to breathe. Hannah, I already know how to breathe. I wouldn't be alive if I didn't know how to breathe properly. Well, I'm here to show you one of my favorite breathwork practices, Samavriti Pranayama or box breath. Let's dive in. I love this practice because it is so simple. All you need to do is breathe in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 4, exhale for 4, and then hold on the breath out for 4. Imagine you're drawing a box with your breath. You can also visualize other shapes that help you keep track of your breath, but eventually you'll get the habit. Box breathing helps to stimulate your parasympathetic nervous system, otherwise known as your state of resting and digesting. Let me know how you go with this practice. I hope you have a wonderful day.
I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I'm not biased. So Han does an excellent job of explaining the general application of box breathing, but why are we doing it in an exam? Well, the Navy SEALs do it. They do it to calm their nerves and heighten their focus before high pressure situations. Enough said. I also wanted to note that, look, chances are you'll probably ignore this stage and regard it as a waste of time. To that, I have one thing to say. Taking these 2 box breaths is as much a waste of time as is pumping up your bike tires right before a 50-kilometer race around the river. It is your choice. Prime your bike to perform at its best, or deliberately hinder it. I know what I'm choosing. Here's a tip to get the most benefit from this stage. Perform the breaths with your eyes closed, but leaving them open still works. Before we wrap up this phase, one key takeaway. Don't waste your reading time. Have you got the message yet? Good. Now let's move to phase 2, the comprehending section. It's worth 30%. This is what the phase looks like. Before we get into those stages, a few miscellaneous comments. Why should I do the comprehending section first? The text you have read will still be fresh in your mind. In other words, so you don't do what Sarah did in cautionary tale number 1. Sarah wasted the reading time and spent 10 minutes reading during the writing time. Why should I spend 55 minutes instead of 60 minutes on the comprehending section? Because this will give you more time to complete the responding section, which is worth 40% instead of 30%. Checks out. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to question 1, and you've got between 10 to 12 minutes to do this. Here's a quick recap of those planning steps that we looked at all the way back in Module 3. The planning steps are, firstly, underline key parts of the question. This requires you to underline the parts of the question that you need to understand and address. Step number 2 is define key parts of the question. At this stage of the planning steps, you will write a brief explanation of what each key part means or write down some synonyms for the part. Step number 3 requires you to reword the question. Here, you'll replace any words in the question with any of the synonyms that came up in step number 2, or you might rearrange the syntax, sentence structure of the question so the relationship between the concepts becomes clearer. Step number 4 is the main step out of all of them, and it is diagram the elements. This requires you to identify the 2 main elements in the question and draw an arrow between them to indicate what their relationship is. Step number 5 is complete the diagram. This step requires you to identify textual evidence and explain how it's relevant to one or more elements in the diagram. Finally, step number 6 is determine structure. In short, step number 6 just involves determining how many paragraphs your response will be. Those are our planning steps. Why do we use them again? Oh, yes, because failing to plan is planning to fail. Bear in mind the following tip for this stage. Skip steps 1 to 3 if you already understand every part of the question. Revisit the lesson on planning in Module 3 if that point doesn't make sense. I've got a full-length explanation of what this is all about there. Stage 2, write your response to question 1, and for this you've got between 15 to 17 minutes. Explanation. Firstly, step 6 of the planning steps informs how many paragraphs you'll write for this response. Second point, use the elements of Teal as Lego blocks to construct your response. What is the rationale for the time allocation of 15 to 17 minutes? This amount of time to write a 200 to 300 word response is ample, mainly because the planning steps scaffold its contents. You've already got a skeleton structure for your answer. Hot tip in relation to stage 2. The explain part of a Teal analytical paragraph is where most marks are awarded. This is because it is practically the only part of an entire essay that directly involves examining a text in detail. Here is another hot tip for this stage. This is a big one. Move on to the next question or section if you haven't completed the response after the approximate 17 minutes of time. Stage 3, use the planning steps to plan your response to question 2. You've got between 10 to 12 minutes. This is the exact same process as stage 1, so refer to those instructions. Stage 4, write your response to question 2, between 15 to 17 minutes. Stage 4 is the exact same thing as stage 2, refer to those specific instructions. That's all you do for the comprehending section. It is as simple as that. A key takeaway, complete this section first while the texts are still fresh in your mind. Please. Phase 3, responding section, 40%. Let's do it. This is an overview of what this phase entails. Miscellaneous comments first. Why should I do the responding section next? Mainly because you've still got your analytical thinking cap on from the comprehending section that you just did. If you did the composing section in phase 3, you'd be shifting gears from analyzing in the comprehending section to creating in the composing section and back to analyzing in the responding section. Here is the kicker. If you do the responding section immediately after the comprehending section, you're only shifting gears once. From analyzing to creating. For this reason, completing the responding section in phase 3 maximizes efficiency. Why should I spend 70 instead of 60 minutes on the comprehending section? All right, this is a really important point in the entire lesson. Listen up. Scars' recommendation is that you spend 60 minutes on section 1, 60 on section 2, and 60 on section 3. But section 2 is worth 40% and section 1 and 3 are worth 30. So my question is, where is the logic in spending the same amount of time on a section that is actually worth 10% more than the other two? For that reason, the EAMS exam strategy suggests you apportion time to a given section based on its weighting. So you've got 180 minutes of writing time to get a maximum of 100 marks. That means you've got 1.8 minutes per mark. 1.8 times 30 marks for the comprehending and composing section equals 54 minutes. We round up to 55. 1.8 times 40 for the responding section equates to 72. We round down to 70. So with that stuff out of the way, let's talk about the actual stages in this phase. Stage 1 is use the planning steps to plan your response to the question you mark in phase 1, stage 3. You do this for about 10 to 15 minutes. Here's a brief recap of what those planning steps are for this section. Let's compare the planning steps from the comprehending section to the planning steps in the responding section. For both the comprehending section and responding section, step 1 requires you to identify the words in the question that you need to understand and address. The same thing can be said about step 2, defining those key parts of the question. In both sections, you should jot down a brief explanation of what those words mean and/or write some synonyms for words in the question that you're not sure of. Another similarity for both sections is step 3, rewording the question. Here, in both sections, you should replace any words in the question that you don't fully understand with synonyms and/or rearrange the syntax of the question, the sentence structure of the question, so the relationship between concepts is more clear. This is where things start to vary a little bit at step 4, diagram the elements. So here we're identifying the 3 main elements in the question and we're showing how they relate to one another with an arrow or arrows. Step number 5 is complete the diagram. In the responding section, you should identify textual evidence and explain how it's relevant to 2 or more elements in the diagram. Step number 6 is once again different between both sections. In the responding section though, you should determine your thesis, the topic sentence of each body paragraph, and the textual evidence that will be analyzed in each body paragraph. That's a little recap of what the planning steps are for this section. What is the rationale? Well, I hate to break it to you, but failing to plan is actually planning to fail. Couple of tips: skip steps 1 to 3 if you already understand each part of the question. Here's one that we've heard before, I believe. Don't waste time second guessing the question you marked with an asterisk. Trust your gut and yourself. Those are some wise words. Stage 2, write your response to the question 55 to 60 minutes. Explanation. Remember the double-ended funnel essay structure and the elements it contains? Well, that's what you should use to write your response. What's the rationale for the total time allocation? We've already discussed this. 70 minutes, it's 10 minutes more than Skars's recommendation. Most of that additional 10 minutes should be spent writing your response. Few tips in relation to this stage. Recall that you should memorize the plot synopsis of the text you study because the plot synopsis is the one and only thing that you will write in every single responding section essay that will pretty much remain the same regardless of the question. Another tip, this one is a goodie. The explain part of a teal analytical paragraph is where most marks are awarded. This is because it's practically the only part that directly involves examining a text. Also, don't forget to adhere to the structure of a teal body paragraph. Final tip, and this is also very important, move on to the next section if you haven't completed the response after about 60 minutes. To wrap up this phase, key takeaway time, this section's 40% weighting justifies spending extra time on it. Let's check out phase 4. It's the composing section, 30% weighting. This is an overview of what this phase entails. Few miscellaneous things before we get into it. Why should I do the responding section last? It's the switching gears thing again. Switching gears requires energy. Energy is something you want to maximize over the course of a 3+ hour exam. Okay, but why should I spend 55 minutes instead of 60 minutes on this section? Because it's worth 30 marks and 1.8 minutes per mark equals about 55 minutes. That stuff's out of the way. Let's talk about stage 1, using the planning steps to plan your response to the question, importantly the one that you marked in phase 1, stage 3. Here's an overview of those steps for the different text types. Step 1. For composing section questions of a persuasive or interpretive nature, we underline keywords. For composing section questions that are of an imaginative nature, we underline keywords. Oh. Step 2 of the planning steps. For persuasive and interpretive, we define keywords. And for imaginative, get out of here. We define keywords. Step number 3. Persuasive and interpretive, we plan our pack. Imaginative, we choose the genre or genres of subject matter. Step number 4. For persuasive and interpretive, we choose a voice. For imaginative, we plan our pack. Note, it is the cultural context only, not situational. Then we have step number 5. For persuasive and interpretive responses, we determine structure. This essentially involves deciding how you'll activate the audience and the main things you'll discuss in each body paragraph for both of these text types. Finally, we have imaginative, and this is where we select the narrative POV and type of narrator. As we've already established, we've got first, second, and third person point of view, and we've got internal and external narrators. After step number 5, we have step number 6. For persuasive and interpretive, we create the title. For imaginative, we determine structure. At this stage, we determine what the elements of the exposition, background, rising action, climax, and resolution will look like in our story. Then we've got step number 7. Not a thing for comprehending and responding section questions, nor is it for persuasive and interpretive, but it is for imaginative, and that is pick a theme. Step number 8, it's the same thing as step 7. Not a thing for comprehending, responding, persuasive, or interpretive, but it is for imaginative. It's where we create our title. Note, you're just creating a title. Welcome back. What is the rationale for doing this? Yep. Failing to plan is planning to fail. I swear that's the last time I'm going to say it, at least in this lesson. Few tips in relation to this stage. Skip step 1 and step 2 if you already understand every word in the question. Another tip, don't underestimate your situational context in a persuasive or interpretive text. Final tip, don't waste time second guessing the question you marked with an asterisk. Trust your gut and yourself. Stage 2, write your response to the question, and you've got about 40 to 45 minutes to do this. How exactly do we go about this? For a persuasive text or interpretive text, use the appropriate version of the double-ended funnel structure and the elements it contains to write your response. For an imaginative text, use the inverted claw short story structure and the elements it contains to write your response. The rationale for this, we already know, same for the comprehending section. 30% weighting means less marks than the responding section, which means less time. A few tips in relation to this stage. Each element of a persuasive speech, firstly, should be written in its proper order. For example, topic sentence, then elaboration. And each element typically represents 1 to 5 sentences. Turning to interpretive texts, each subsection of a blog post should firstly be written in its proper order. For instance, idea and then example. And each subsection typically represents 1 or more mini paragraphs. Finally, turning to the elements of a short story. They can be written in any order provided it's addressed in the appropriate section. For instance, the exposition contains 3 elements: characters, setting, and action. You can establish any of those elements anywhere in the exposition. The elements are typically blended into several sentences or mini paragraphs. So instead of it just being categorized and kind of segmented off from one another, they're all interwoven. Our key takeaway for this phase, complete the composing section last to preserve energy and to avoid unnecessarily switching gears. Love your work, love my work, love our work. Let's turn to the last phase. It's phase 5. This is where we review. Here is an overview of our 5th and final phase. We're addressing the key takeaway right at the outset. Commence this phase if you've finished writing your composing section response, your last response, with more than 1 minute remaining before the exam's over. That is the application of what we're about to discuss. Stage 1, complete any unfinished responses. What's this about? As noted earlier, you should move on to the next question or section in phase 2 and phase 3 if you haven't finished writing the relevant response within the specific time allocation. Let's say I get to the end of my writing time allocation for my response in the responding section, and I'm yet to write my conclusion. That means I move on to the composing section, and let's say I finish that early. I can move on to phase 5, look at stage 1, complete any unfinished responses, and an unfinished response would be the conclusion from the responding section. What is the rationale for this? Well, completing any unfinished responses is more important than reviewing finished ones. This goes without saying. Your main priority, if you make it to phase 5, is to go and finish any unfinished responses. A tip in relation to this stage. If you didn't finish more than one response, meaning that you've both got the comprehending and responding sections unfinished, finish the responding section because it's worth the most marks. Stage 2, select a response to review. Explanation. In short, once you're at this stage, you will have written 4 whole responses. 2 of those responses have come from the comprehending section, 1 response from the responding, last one from the composing. Out of those 4 responses, select the one that you feel least confident about. Rationale for this is pretty self-explanatory. The one you feel least confident about is probably the one that could benefit the most from a review. Once again, trust your gut on this one. Don't waste time figuring out which one to review. And a tip in relation to this stage. Choose your responding section response if you're unsure about which one to select. Stage 3, review the response by applying the appropriate review principle or principles. What's this all about? If you're reviewing a comprehending section response, apply writing concisely principle. If you're reviewing a responding section response, apply the writing concisely principle. If you're reviewing a persuasive speech, apply the writing concisely principle and structure principle. If you're reviewing a blog post, apply the writing concisely principle and structure principle. Last but not least, if you're reviewing a short story, apply the imagery, punctuation, and paragraphing principle and structure principle. Hat hair, it's come back, not with a huge vengeance, but it's got a bit of a vendetta. Why do we even bother reviewing responses? We review our responses because it might earn you a couple of extra marks you wouldn't receive if you had just squandered this spare time. Don't forget that every single mark you get in the exam is worth 0.5% of your entire English ATAR mark. Don't think I can overemphasize that. A tip in relation to this stage: don't worry about applying every step of the relevant principle, just apply a simplified version of it. For the writing concisely principle, there are a bunch of different stages and steps. In the exam, just read over your response and look for ways to make it more concise. Our final stage of this phase and of the entire exam strategy. Repeat stage 2 and stage 3 until the exam's finished. And our last key takeaway for the lesson: don't aim to have time to review your responses. Focus on completing each phase within its total time allocation and start reviewing only if you happen to finish early. That's the English ATAR Made Simple exam strategy. This is a simple summary. We started off with an overview of the pair, but that is not examinable content or stuff that is directly applicable to your completion of the exam. Not going to be in our simple summary, but our overview of the strategy obviously will be. That's why we're here. Phase 1 is reading. Total time allocation, 10 minutes. Stage 1, choose your responding section question and composing section question. Do that in about 2 to 3 minutes. Stage 2, read the comprehending section text. Do that in about 7 to 8 minutes. Stage 3, mark your responding section question and composing section question. That will take about 10 seconds, and you do that immediately after the invigilator says you can start writing. Stage 4, arguably the most important, take 2 deep breaths. That'll take approximately 30 seconds. Then we discussed phase 2, comprehending. It's worth 30% of your exam. Total time allocation for this phase, 55 minutes. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to question 1. Do that in about 10 to 12 minutes. Stage 2, write your response to question 1. Do that in about 15 to 17 minutes. Stage 3, do the same thing that you did in stage 1. You plan your response to question 2 in about 10 to 12 minutes. Fourth and final stage of this phase involves writing your response to question 2 in about 15 to 17 minutes. Then we moved on to phase 3. It's the responding section, worth 40%. Total time allocation for this phase, 70 minutes. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to the question that you marked in phase 1, stage 3 with an asterisk. Do that in about 10 to 15 minutes. Stage 2, write your response in about 55 to 60 minutes. Phase 4, it's the composing section, worth 30%. For that reason, you've got a total time allocation of 55 minutes. Stage 1, use the planning steps to plan your response to the question you marked in phase 1, stage 3 with an asterisk. Do that in about 10 to 15 minutes. Stage 2 of phase 4, write your response to the question in 40 to 45 minutes. Then we move on to phase 5. It's reviewing, last one of the entire strategy. Total time allocation, it's not defined. Any remaining spare time if you finish early. Only if. Stage 1, complete any unfinished responses. Stage 2, select a response to review. Stage 3, review the response by applying the appropriate review principles, but just an overview of it, a really condensed version. Bear those things in mind. Stage 4, repeat stage 2 and 3 until the exam's finished. All of that is really to say there is no reason why you should be doing anything but your exam during the 3 hours and 10 minutes you're in that exam hall. Don't leave early. Use the time. There is always a way to improve your response, and wasting that is not a good idea when this thing is worth quite a lot. So we outlined what the EAMS exam strategy is, then we went and discussed each phase of it in more detail. Key takeaway of phase 1, reading, don't waste your reading time. Key takeaway of phase 2, comprehending, complete this section first while the texts are still fresh in your mind. Phase 3, responding. This section's 40% weighting justifies spending a little bit of extra time on it. Phase 4, composing. Complete this section last to preserve energy and avoid unnecessarily switching gears. Fifth and final phase, it's reviewing. Commence this phase if you finish writing your composing section response, your last response, with more than 1 minute remaining before the exam's over. Our last simple summary point for this lesson. Don't aim to have time to review your responses. Focus on completing each phase within its total time allocation and starting reviewing only if you happen to finish early. Another stellar effort across the board. Go us. Before proceeding to the next lesson, make sure you complete the activities for this one. Good news is they'll only take 20 minutes to complete, and I really do mean that. So, now that you have learned the essential concepts of English ATAR, how to command the comprehending section, how to rule the responding section, how to conquer the composing section, and the EAMS exam strategy, there's only one thing left to do. I'll see you in the next lesson. Until then,